For most of Earth's history, the oceans ruled the planet. Long before cities, long before civilizations, even before animals walked across the land, vast blue waters covered most of the world. Continents existed, but they were smaller players in a planet governed by the sea. Life, in those distant ages, belonged almost entirely to the oceans. If someone could have drifted above those ancient waters, the scene would have appeared serene. Sunlight poured through warm surface layers, illuminating broad continental shelves, where reefs spread like underwater forests. Strange early fish moved through the currents with slow confidence, their shapes unfamiliar to modern eyes but perfectly suited to their world. Soft-bodied creatures rested along the seafloor. Plankton floated endlessly through the water column, carried by gentle tides that had circled the globe for millions of years. Everything seemed balanced. The oceans breathed in rhythms older than any creature living within them. These waters were more than scenery for life. They were the system that made life possible. Ocean currents carried oxygen into the depths and lifted nutrients toward the sunlit surface where microscopic organisms flourished. Those tiny drifting cells formed the base of immense food chains, feeding animals large and small across thousands of kilometers of open sea. Slowly, endlessly, the oceans regulated the planet itself. Heat absorbed near the equator drifted toward cooler regions through invisible highways of moving water. Storms gathered energy from warm seas, while deep currents carried cold water back toward the surface. The result was a planet that remained stable for astonishing stretches of time. Millions of years passed with ecosystems growing more intricate, more interconnected, and more resilient. At least, that was how it appeared. Because even in this peaceful world, subtle changes were already beginning. The creatures living in those ancient seas could not notice them. To a drifting plankton cell, or a fish gliding through the shallows, the ocean felt the same as it had for countless generations. The currents still moved. The sunlight still reached the reefs. Food still drifted through the water in quiet abundance. But the balance beneath that calm surface was beginning to shift. Temperatures in some regions were rising, altering the density of surface waters. Subtle changes in climate were adjusting wind patterns that had once stirred the seas with reliable force. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the deep currents that carried oxygen into the darkest parts of the ocean were weakening. At first, the difference was so small it left no visible trace. Yet far below the reefs and drifting shoals, where sunlight never reached, the chemistry of the ocean was beginning to change. Oxygen levels in certain deep waters began falling. Not dramatically, not in sudden waves, but gradually, molecule by molecule. Regions that had once received steady flows of oxygen, rich water, became quieter, more stagnant. The life that depended on those invisible currents could not sense the shift yet, but the conditions sustaining them were beginning to fade. From above, the ocean still looked peaceful. Coral structures continued growing toward the light. Fish continued moving through the currents as they always had. Entire ecosystems carried on with the slow confidence of a world that seemed permanent. But permanence on Earth is often an illusion. Deep in the silent layers of those ancient seas, something important was beginning to disappear. To understand what was changing in those ancient seas, the gaze must sink below the bright surface where reefs glowed and fish moved through warm light. Down there, beneath the drifting plankton and shimmering shallows, the ocean entered a different world entirely. The sunlight faded. Colors dissolved into deep blue, then darker shades that eventually became endless night. In this quiet darkness, life continued in slower rhythms, dependent on something invisible, yet absolutely essential. Oxygen. On land, animals breathe it from the air without thinking. In the ocean, it must travel through water, carried slowly by the movement of currents that connect the surface to the deep. For millions of years, this invisible circulation acted like the lungs of the planet. Winds stirred the upper ocean, waves churned the surface, and cold, dense water sank toward the depths, carrying oxygen with it. In return, deeper waters gradually rose again, bringing nutrients upward to fuel new life near the sunlit surface. The entire system worked with remarkable balance. Oxygen reached even the darkest parts of the sea floor, allowing countless creatures to survive far from sunlight. Strange animals crawled along the sediments. Soft-bodied organisms filtered drifting particles from the water. The deep ocean was quiet, but it was not empty. It was part of a living network sustained by the slow breathing of the sea. But that breathing depended on movement, and movement in the oceans depends on temperature. As the planet slowly warmed during this ancient era, subtle changes began forming within the upper layers of the sea. Warm water became lighter than the colder water beneath it. Instead of mixing freely, the layers began separating like oil floating above a darker liquid. The surface remained bright and full of life, stirred by wind and sunlight, while the deeper waters grew increasingly isolated. At first, the change seemed insignificant. The current still flowed, and oxygen still reached the depths. Yet the delivery became weaker, less consistent than it had been before. Deep water that once received fresh supplies of oxygen began waiting longer between each renewal. Life on the sea floor could not see this shift happening. Creatures continued feeding, drifting, reproducing as they always had. But in certain regions of the ocean, the oxygen surrounding them was quietly declining. The difference was small in the beginning. Then it grew. Over thousands of years, some areas of deep water became so poorly mixed that oxygen levels dropped to fractions of their former levels. Animals that depended on steady oxygen began struggling to survive. Some species migrated toward better conditions if they could. Others simply vanished from those regions. In their place, different organisms began to dominate. Tiny microbes, ancient and resilient, thrived where oxygen was scarce. These microorganisms had evolved long before complex animals appeared on Earth, and they possessed unusual ways of surviving in environments that would suffocate most other life. As oxygen faded completely in certain pockets of the ocean, these microbes turned to another chemical process to sustain themselves. Instead of oxygen, they began using sulfur compounds dissolved in seawater. The result of this process was a gas called hydrogen sulfide, invisible, toxic, deadly to most animals. At first, it formed only in the deepest sediments, where oxygen had already vanished. But over time, as oxygen-starved waters expanded, the production of hydrogen sulfide increased. The ocean was no longer just losing oxygen. It was beginning to create poison in the darkness below, and the quiet transformation unfolding in those depths would not remain hidden forever. What began as quiet chemical changes in the depths did not remain small. Over vast stretches of time, the conditions spreading through those ancient oceans began to expand beyond isolated pockets of stagnant water. The slow disappearance of oxygen created spaces where different forces could take hold. And once those forces began growing, they moved through the sea with patient persistence. Regions that had once supported complex ecosystems started changing in ways few creatures could survive. The oxygen-rich waters that marine animals depended upon became harder to find. Deep basins that once breathed slowly with the circulation of currents grew still and heavy, cut off from the mixing that had once refreshed them. Within those silent depths, hydrogen sulfide continued accumulating. At first it remained trapped in the darkest layers, far beneath the thriving shallows, where reefs stretched toward sunlight and schools of early fish drifted through warm currents. But as oxygen depletion spread across wider portions of the ocean floor, the zone where these toxic conditions existed began expanding outward. What had once been scattered pockets of suffocating water slowly merged into larger regions. The sea itself was changing its character. Creatures that lived along the seafloor were often the first to suffer. Many of them depended on steady oxygen flowing through the sediments where they fed and burrowed. When that supply faded, their environment became hostile in ways they could not escape. Fossil records from these ancient layers show entire communities disappearing from certain regions of the ocean floor. Above them, the effects traveled upward through the food chain. Reefs that had flourished for millions of years began weakening. Coral-like organisms struggled in water that carried less oxygen and unfamiliar chemical traces. As these structures deteriorated, the countless species that relied on them for shelter and food also began to decline. The ocean still looked vast and blue from above, yet below the surface, invisible borders were forming between safe waters and areas where survival had become nearly impossible. Over thousands, then millions of years, these hostile zones spread across continental shelves and deep ocean basins alike. Vast stretches of water turned stagnant, their chemistry dominated by processes that favored microbes rather than animals. Modern scientists studying ancient rocks have uncovered evidence for this transformation. Chemical signatures preserved in sediment layers reveal periods when the deep ocean entered a state known as Eucinia. In such conditions, oxygen disappears almost entirely while hydrogen sulfide becomes abundant in the water below. This discovery forces a shift in how those ancient seas are imagined. The oceans of that era were not simply warm or shallow or filled with unfamiliar creatures. In many places they had become enormous chemical reservoirs, storing toxic compounds in their depths. While the surface continued appearing deceptively calm, life adapted where it could. Some organisms retreated into narrow bands of oxygenated water closer to the surface. Others vanished from entire regions of the ocean, leaving gaps in ecosystems that had existed for tens of millions of years. Yet, an even more troubling possibility emerged from the geological record. Under certain conditions, hydrogen sulfide rising from deep waters could escape into the atmosphere. If enough of that gas reached the air above the oceans, the consequences would extend far beyond marine ecosystems. Hydrogen sulfide is poisonous to most complex life. In large quantities, it can damage the ozone layer that shields Earth from intense ultraviolet radiation. This meant the transformation unfolding beneath the waves might not remain confined to the sea. The oceans themselves had the potential to influence the entire planet. What once appeared to be the stable cradle of life was slowly becoming a system capable of producing danger on a global scale. The quiet blue waters that covered most of Earth were turning into something far less familiar. And the deeper scientists look into this ancient mystery, the clearer one question becomes. If the oceans were changing so dramatically, something larger must have been pushing them toward that transformation. To understand why the oceans were changing, the story must leave the water for a moment and step onto the solid ground of the ancient world. From the surface, the continents of that distant era might have seemed immovable, vast landscapes of rock and forest resting quietly beneath the sky. But appearances can be misleading. The ground beneath those ancient ecosystems was never truly still. Earth's outer shell is divided into enormous slabs of rock, known as tectonic plates. These plates drift slowly across the surface of the planet, carried by currents of heat, rising from deep within the mantle. Their movement is almost impossible to notice within a human lifetime. A continent may travel only a few centimeters each year, less than the width of a fingernail. Yet over millions of years, those small motions reshape the face of the planet. Oceans open and close. Mountain ranges rise where plates collide. Entire continents gather together and later drift apart again. During the age when the oceans were beginning their quiet transformation, the continents were arranged very differently from the world we know today. Rather than being scattered across the globe, many of them were gradually converging, drawn together by the slow dance of tectonic forces. When continents collide, they do not simply stop. The crust crumples, thickens, and folds upward into enormous mountain chains. At the same time, vast landmasses merge into supercontinents, planets spanning regions of rock that dramatically reshape the way oceans circulate around them. Imagine the ocean currents of the modern world, suddenly forced to navigate a completely new arrangement of land. Pathways that once carried water freely across the globe would become blocked or redirected. Warm equatorial currents might weaken. Cold polar waters could struggle to reach distant basins. This is exactly what happens when continents assemble into massive supercontinents. The seas that once circulated freely across the planet begin to behave differently. Ocean currents depend on open pathways. They move heat, oxygen, and nutrients across enormous distances. When the arrangement of continents changes, those pathways change as well. Some currents slow down. Others vanish entirely. New patterns emerge, sometimes isolating large regions of ocean from the global circulation that once sustained them. For marine life, these shifts can be profound. Regions that once received steady supplies of oxygen, rich water may gradually become stagnant. Nutrients that once traveled through balanced cycles may accumulate in unexpected places. The delicate systems that regulate marine ecosystems begin to shift in ways that are subtle at first, yet powerful over long stretches of time. The poisoning of the oceans, it turns out, was not the result of a sudden catastrophe. It was the outcome of countless slow changes unfolding together. Continents drifting, currents weakening, climate adjusting in response to new geography. All of these processes interacted across millions of years, gradually pushing the oceans toward conditions that favored stagnation rather than circulation. Yet tectonic movement alone does not explain everything that happened next. Because while continents moved across the surface, another force was building beneath them. Far below the crust, heat continued rising from Earth's interior, gathering pressure in enormous reservoirs of molten rock. Eventually, that pressure would find a way to escape, and when it did, the consequences would reach far beyond the land where those eruptions began. Far beneath the continents, long before any visible eruption reached the surface, immense reservoirs of molten rock were gathering strength. The heat rising from Earth's interior had always shaped the planet, but sometimes that energy builds quietly until it finds an escape on a scale almost impossible to imagine. When it does, the result is not a single dramatic explosion or a towering volcanic cone. Instead, the ground itself begins to tear open. Across enormous regions of the planet, cracks can spread through the crust like slow fractures in stone. From those openings, lava pours outward in rivers of fire, flooding the surrounding land again and again. These eruptions do not last for days or months. They continue for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years, covering entire landscapes in layer after layer of molten rock. Geologists call these events large igneous provinces. The name sounds technical, almost harmless, yet the reality behind it is staggering. During these episodes, lava can spread across millions of square kilometers, burying forests, plains, and ancient ecosystems beneath thick sheets of basalt. Each new eruption pours fresh molten rock over the hardened layers beneath it, slowly building vast plateaus of dark volcanic stone. But the lava itself is only part of the story. Every eruption releases enormous volumes of gas trapped deep inside the earth. Carbon dioxide escapes first, rising invisibly into the atmosphere. Methane follows, along with sulfur compounds and other volcanic gases that drift upward through the sky. Individually, these emissions might seem small compared to the scale of the planet's atmosphere. But over thousands of years, the gases accumulate. Carbon dioxide and methane trap heat that would otherwise escape into space. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the planet begins to warm. Temperatures climb by degrees that seem modest on paper, but carry enormous consequences for the systems regulating Earth's oceans. Water responds quickly to heat. As oceans grow warmer, the delicate balance that allows oxygen to dissolve into seawater begins to change. Warmer water simply cannot hold as much oxygen as colder water can. At the same time, increased heat strengthens the layering of the ocean, making it harder for surface waters to mix with the depths below. The breathing of the sea becomes weaker. Meanwhile, the changes on land trigger another chain of events. Rainfall and erosion begin breaking down freshly formed volcanic rock, washing nutrients into rivers that eventually carry them toward the sea. These nutrients act like fertilizer once they reach the ocean's surface. Microscopic organisms respond immediately. Huge blooms of plankton spread across the upper layers of the water, multiplying in numbers that would have been impossible under normal conditions. For a time, this explosion of life might even appear beneficial. The ocean surface fills with activity as countless tiny cells drift through the sunlit waters, but when those organisms die, they sink. Their bodies fall slowly into deeper layers of the ocean where bacteria begin breaking them down. That process consumes oxygen, drawing it out of the surrounding water. The more plankton that bloom at the surface, the more oxygen disappears in the depths below. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Warmer oceans hold less oxygen. Microbial blooms consume what remains. Stagnant currents struggle to replenish the supply. When scientists examine ancient rock layers from these periods, they often discover something remarkable. The chemical fingerprints of oxygen-poor oceans appear at the same time as the geological evidence of massive volcanic eruptions. Again and again, the same pattern emerges. It suggests that the oceans were not simply drifting toward oxygen loss on their own. They were being pushed there by forces rising from deep inside the Earth. And as those forces continued reshaping the atmosphere and oceans, the creatures living within those waters began approaching a dangerous threshold. Long before the great extinction lines appear in stone, the oceans were already whispering that something was wrong. The warning signs did not arrive as a single moment of collapse. Instead, they appeared gradually, scattered through layers of sediment that today lie silent beneath continents and seas. To the creatures living in those ancient waters, the change would have felt subtle at first. The ocean still stretched endlessly across the planet. Sunlight still reached the shallow reefs. Currents still moved through the open sea. Yet within those familiar rhythms, the environment sustaining life was beginning to shift. Scientists studying the fossil record have found that many marine ecosystems began weakening long before the most dramatic extinctions occurred. In sediment layers from different parts of the world, certain species begin disappearing in small waves. Entire communities that once flourished across vast regions slowly fade from the geological record. At first, the losses seem scattered and isolated. A species vanishes here, another declines somewhere else. But when those patterns are examined across millions of years, a troubling picture begins to emerge. The oceans were becoming more difficult places to survive. The first creatures to suffer were those living on the seafloor. Many of these animals depended on oxygen, rich water flowing steadily across the sediments where they fed and burrowed. When oxygen levels began falling in deeper waters, these organisms had almost no ability to escape. Unlike fish or drifting plankton, bottom-dwelling animals could not easily migrate away from spreading anoxic zones. As oxygen-poor waters expanded across the seafloor, entire communities were gradually suffocated. Their disappearance left quiet gaps in ecosystems that had existed for millions of years. Above them, the effects began spreading upward through the food chain. Reef systems that once supported extraordinary diversity started weakening as chemical conditions changed. Coral, like organisms, struggled in waters where oxygen was lower and unfamiliar compounds circulated through the currents. When reefs decline, the consequences ripple outward. These structures serve as nurseries, feeding grounds, and shelters for countless species. As reef ecosystems deteriorated, the intricate networks of predators, grazers, and filter feeders that depended on them also began to unravel. Some animals responded by migrating. Mobile species searched for regions where oxygen levels remained stable, retreating toward shallow waters or distant ocean basins where circulation still delivered breathable conditions. But migration could only solve the problem temporarily. As environmental stress continued spreading, safe regions became fewer. Other species simply vanished. The fossil record preserves their absence as quiet breaks in time. Creatures that had existed for millions of years suddenly disappear from the sediments where their remains once accumulated. In their place, simpler organisms sometimes appear, species capable of surviving in harsher conditions that more complex animals could not tolerate. These shifts reveal something important about the state of the oceans during this period. The crisis was not unfolding everywhere at the same moment. Instead, it spread gradually across the planet, weakening ecosystems region by region. Life adapted where it could, but the overall trend was becoming clear. The oceans were approaching a tipping point. For long stretches of geological time, environmental systems can absorb gradual stress while appearing outwardly stable. Currents may weaken slowly. Oxygen may decline step by step. Ecosystems may lose species without collapsing entirely. But eventually a threshold is crossed. Once that threshold is reached, change can accelerate with surprising speed. Geological evidence shows that when these tipping points arrived in ancient oceans, the results could unfold rapidly on the scale of Earth's history. Ecosystems that had already been weakened by slow environmental pressure were suddenly unable to recover. What followed would become one of the most severe biological crises the planet had ever experienced. Because by this stage, the oceans were no longer simply struggling to support life. They were quietly preparing the conditions that would test whether much of that life could survive at all. For an extraordinarily long time, the oceans had endured change without collapsing. Temperatures shifted slowly, continents moved across the globe. Volcanic gases entered the atmosphere and gradually altered the chemistry of air and water. Yet life continued adapting, adjusting generation after generation to a planet that was never truly still. The seas absorbed these changes the way a deep reservoir absorbs falling rain. Small disturbances vanished within the vastness of the system. Oxygen declined in some regions, but currents still carried enough fresh water from the surface to keep ecosystems alive. Microbial communities expanded in certain basins, yet complex animals continued swimming through most of the ocean without noticing the quiet transformation unfolding beneath them. For millions of years, the balance held, but Earth's systems are rarely infinite in their tolerance. Beneath the slow drift of environmental change, invisible thresholds exist. For long periods they remain distant, barely approached. Then, sometimes without warning, the conditions of the planet move past them. In the ancient oceans, that moment was approaching. Scientists studying the chemistry preserved in ancient sediment layers have found evidence that oxygen levels in some regions fell to critical limits. These were not sudden drops, but gradual declines that continued for thousands of years. Eventually, the water reached a point where oxygen became so scarce that the familiar biological cycles maintaining the ocean could no longer function as they once had. Something new began taking over. When oxygen is plentiful, complex ecosystems dominate the sea. Fish, invertebrates, and countless microscopic organisms share an intricate balance of feeding, decay, and renewal. But when oxygen becomes scarce, different life forms gain the advantage. Microbes that thrive in oxygen-poor environments began multiplying in the deep waters. These microorganisms fed on organic material, drifting down from the sunlit surface. Every dead plankton cell, every fragment of decaying plant life sinking slowly through the water column, became food for expanding bacterial communities below. As those microbes consumed organic matter, they drew even more oxygen out of the surrounding water. The effect was subtle at first, but powerful. The less oxygen remained, the easier it became for these microbes to dominate the environment. And the more they multiplied, the faster the remaining oxygen disappeared. A feedback loop had begun. Conditions that once supported a wide diversity of life were gradually transforming into environments dominated by chemical reactions, rather than biological balance. Regions of the ocean that had once been stable ecosystems began behaving more like enormous fermentation chambers, dark waters where bacterial activity reshaped the chemistry of the sea. In those stagnant depths, oxygen no longer defined the environment. Instead, the breakdown of organic material and the growth of specialized microbes began controlling what the ocean would become next. For marine organisms that had evolved for millions of years in oxygen-rich waters, this shift was devastating. Creatures that depended on steady oxygen levels could not survive long in these altered environments. Some attempted to migrate toward shallower waters, where circulation still provided breathable conditions. Others simply vanished from the regions where their species had once flourished. What made this transformation so dangerous was its speed. For ages, environmental change had been slow enough for life to adapt. But once the tipping point was crossed, the chemistry of the ocean began shifting much faster than before. The system had entered a new phase. The oceans were no longer just losing oxygen. They were beginning to reorganize themselves in ways that favored microbial life over complex ecosystems. And as microbial activity intensified in these expanding oxygen-poor waters, another process was quietly beginning to unfold, one that would soon make the seas far more dangerous than anyone living within them could possibly sense. Once oxygen vanished from large portions of the ocean, the rules governing life beneath the waves began to change. For millions of years, the deep sea had relied on a familiar system. Animals consumed oxygen. Organic matter sank from above. Microbes helped recycle nutrients back into the water. It was a cycle that had supported complex marine ecosystems for ages. But that cycle depended on oxygen. When oxygen disappeared, a different group of organisms stepped forward to fill the void. These microbes had existed long before complex animals evolved, and they possessed abilities that made them uniquely suited for the new conditions spreading through the depths. They are known today as sulfate, reducing bacteria. Unlike most creatures in the ocean, these microorganisms do not require oxygen to survive. Instead, they draw energy from a different chemical pathway hidden within seawater itself. Dissolved throughout the ocean is a compound called sulfate, carried there through the slow erosion of rocks on land. In oxygen-rich environments, sulfate remains relatively stable, rarely playing a dramatic role in the chemistry of life. But when oxygen disappears, these bacteria begin using sulfate as their fuel. In the process, they transform it into hydrogen sulfide. The gas is invisible, but its presence is unmistakable. In small concentrations, it produces the sharp odor often associated with rotting eggs. In larger quantities, it becomes deadly. Hydrogen sulfide interferes with the ability of cells to process oxygen, effectively shutting down respiration in animals that encounter it. In the modern world, traces of this gas can sometimes be found in unusual environments. Certain deep-sea vents release it from beneath the ocean floor. Stagnant coastal waters occasionally accumulate small pockets where oxygen has vanished. In those places, specialized organisms have evolved to tolerate the toxic conditions, but the ancient oceans were experiencing something far larger. As oxygen-free waters expanded across the seafloor, sulfate-reducing bacteria multiplied rapidly. The deeper layers of the ocean became ideal environments for these microbes to flourish. Organic material drifting down from the surface provided a constant supply of food, while the absence of oxygen removed the competition from most other life. The result was a slow but relentless transformation. Hydrogen sulfide began accumulating in the deep ocean. At first, the gas remained confined to sediments and isolated pockets of stagnant water. Yet as microbial activity intensified, entire layers of deep ocean water may have become saturated with it. Vast regions that once supported thriving ecosystems gradually turned into environments dominated by microbial chemistry. To a creature swimming into those waters, the change would have been sudden and lethal. The poison carried no color, no visible warning. Fish or invertebrates crossing into these zones would encounter an invisible cloud capable of halting respiration almost instantly. In places where hydrogen sulfide concentrations rose high enough, even brief exposure could prove fatal. The deeper ocean was no longer merely starved of oxygen. It was becoming actively toxic. Geological evidence preserved in ancient rock layers suggests that these hydrogen sulfide-rich waters did not always remain confined to the depths. Ocean circulation occasionally shifts in ways that allow deeper waters to rise toward the surface. When that happens, the chemistry stored in those dark layers can suddenly appear in shallower environments where complex ecosystems depend on stable conditions. If such events occurred during this ancient crisis, entire marine communities could have been devastated in a matter of days. Reefs, fish populations, and plankton systems might have collapsed almost instantly as toxic water surged upward through the ocean. And as hydrogen sulfide continued accumulating in the deep sea, scientists studying these ancient events began asking a question even more unsettling than the transformation already unfolding below. What if some of that poison had not stopped at the ocean's surface? For a long time, scientists assumed that whatever happened in the depths of ancient oceans stayed there. The dark basins where oxygen vanished and toxic gases accumulated were thought to be isolated worlds, sealed beneath layers of circulating water. The surface seas, filled with sunlight and drifting life, seemed protected from the chemistry unfolding far below. But the more carefully researchers examined ancient rock formations, the more complicated the story became. The oceans do not remain perfectly layered forever. Even in calm periods, currents slowly move water from one depth to another. Sometimes, under certain conditions, those movements become far more dramatic. Entire layers of deep water can begin rising toward the surface in events known as overturning. In the modern world, such shifts are usually harmless. Cold deep water rises, releases nutrients, and supports bursts of life in the sunlit ocean above. But in the ancient seas, the chemistry of the depth had become something very different. Instead of nutrient-rich water, those rising currents may have carried hydrogen sulfide. The moment such water reached the upper layers of the ocean, something remarkable would happen. Near the surface, oxygen remained far more abundant than in the depths. When hydrogen sulfide, rich water, encountered that oxygenated environment, the gas could escape from the sea into the air above. In effect, the ocean itself could begin releasing poison into the atmosphere. Evidence for this possibility comes from subtle chemical clues preserved in ancient rock layers. Certain minerals and isotopes found in sediments suggest that sulfur compounds once interacted with the atmosphere in unusual ways. These signatures are difficult to explain unless hydrogen sulfide occasionally reached the surface in significant quantities. If that interpretation is correct, the implications are extraordinary. Hydrogen sulfide is dangerous not only because it is toxic to animals, it also interacts with the chemistry of the upper atmosphere. Large amounts of the gas can disrupt the delicate reactions that maintain Earth's ozone layer. The ozone layer acts as an invisible shield high above the planet. It absorbs much of the ultraviolet radiation streaming from the sun, protecting life on the surface from harmful exposure. Without that protection, intense ultraviolet light would reach the ground and the oceans in far greater quantities. If hydrogen sulfide damaged this shield during ancient ocean crises, the effects could extend far beyond the water. On land, early plant communities would face sudden increases in ultraviolet radiation. Leaves and tissues not adapted to such exposure could suffer severe damage. Growth patterns might change, entire ecosystems could weaken as the balance between sunlight and life shifted in unexpected ways. The oceans themselves would not escape the consequences either. Plankton drifting near the surface are especially sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. These microscopic organisms form the base of marine food webs. If their populations declined under increased radiation, the effects would ripple through every layer of ocean life above them. Meanwhile, deeper waters continued suffocating. The same stagnant conditions that allowed hydrogen sulfide to accumulate were still spreading through large regions of the ocean. Oxygen levels remained dangerously low in the depths, while microbial activity continued reshaping the chemistry of the sea. The crisis was no longer confined to one layer of the environment. For the first time in this story, the oceans, atmosphere, and ecosystems on land were beginning to influence one another in a dangerous cycle. Toxic gases rising from the sea could alter the atmosphere. Changes in the atmosphere could harm life at the surface, and weakened ecosystems would struggle to stabilize the oceans below. What once seemed like a problem hidden in the deep sea had become something far larger. The oceans were no longer simply losing oxygen. They may have begun releasing poison into the sky. And as these transformations spread across the planet, life itself was approaching one of the greatest survival tests it had ever faced. By the time the oceans had begun producing toxic gases and losing oxygen across vast regions, the living world had already started to feel the consequences. Yet the first signs of collapse were not dramatic. No single moment marked the beginning of extinction. Instead, the evidence appears quietly within the layers of rock that record Earth's past. In those ancient sediments, scientists have discovered a pattern that repeats across many regions of the planet. Species that once flourished in enormous numbers begin to decline. Their remains, once common in the fossil record, grow rare. Eventually they vanish entirely from certain layers of stone. At first glance, these disappearances might seem isolated. A species fades in one location but continues living elsewhere. Another declines gradually before returning again in later deposits. For long periods the changes appear scattered and uneven. But when researchers examine those patterns across multiple oceans and vast stretches of time, something unsettling becomes clear. The oceans were slowly losing diversity. Entire groups of organisms began shrinking in number long before the most severe extinction layers appear. Creatures that had dominated marine ecosystems for millions of years were struggling to survive in waters that were quietly becoming less hospitable. The animals most vulnerable to these changes were those living closest to the ocean floor. Many bottom-dwelling organisms depend on steady flows of oxygen, rich water passing over the sediments where they feed and reproduce. As anoxic zones expanded across the seafloor, these creatures had little chance of escape. Unlike fish that could swim toward shallower waters, most seafloor animals were tied to their environment. When oxygen disappeared from those regions, their habitats vanished with it. The fossil record preserves the silence that followed. Burrowing organisms disappear from certain layers of sediment. Shells that once accumulated in thick deposits become scarce. Entire communities that had occupied the seafloor for ages simply fade away. Above them, the effects continued spreading through the ocean's intricate food webs. Reef systems that had stood as vibrant centers of marine life for millions of years began weakening. These reefs were not just clusters of coral-like organisms. They formed complex ecosystems where predators, grazers, and filter feeders interacted in delicate balance. When environmental conditions changed, that balance began to break. Oxygen levels fluctuated unpredictably. Toxic compounds occasionally drifted upward from deeper waters. Organisms that formed the structural foundations of reef systems struggled to grow under these altered conditions. As reefs declined, countless other species lost their homes. Predators lost hunting grounds. Small fish and invertebrates lost shelter. The countless relationships connecting reef organisms began unraveling in ways that left ecosystems increasingly fragile. Some species adapted by shifting into new environments. Others migrated into regions where oxygen remained stable and water chemistry still supported life. But adaptation and migration could only compensate for so much change. Many species simply vanished. What makes this stage of the story so haunting is how quietly it unfolded. The great extinction layers that later appear in the fossil record may look sudden from a geological perspective, but the collapse of ecosystems began long before those final moments arrived. Generation by generation, the oceans were becoming more difficult places to live. Creatures that had evolved in stable environments now faced shifting conditions that grew more hostile with each passing age. Food chains weakened as key species disappeared. Ecosystems that once seemed resilient revealed how fragile their balance truly was. To the animals swimming through those ancient waters, the change would not have felt like an approaching catastrophe. It would have felt like a world that slowly stopped working the way it once had. And as these fragile ecosystems weakened, the environmental pressures shaping the oceans continued intensifying, pushing life closer to a crisis that would soon reshape the planet itself. For ages the oceans had carried life through cycles of change. Currents shifted, climates warmed or cooled, and ecosystems adjusted slowly over immense spans of time. Yet there came a point when the pressures building within the ancient seas became too great for those systems to absorb. The balance that had sustained marine life for hundreds of millions of years began to fail. Oxygen depletion, once limited to scattered regions of deep water, spread across vast areas of the seafloor. The quiet expansion of anoxic zones that had begun in isolated basins now extended across entire ocean shelves. In these waters, the life-giving gas that most marine animals depended upon was almost entirely gone. At the same time, hydrogen sulfide continued accumulating in the deeper layers of the sea. Warm global temperatures only worsened the situation. As the oceans heated, their ability to dissolve oxygen declined further. Surface waters remained layered above colder depths, preventing fresh supplies of oxygen from reaching the deep ocean. Regions that once breathed slowly through circulation now remained stagnant for longer periods. For marine organisms, the consequences were severe. Across wide stretches of ocean, the environments that had supported thriving ecosystems were turning hostile. Creatures that depended on steady oxygen levels struggled to survive in waters where the chemistry had begun to shift against them. The fossil record reveals how quickly this transformation affected entire communities of life. Reef systems that had flourished for millions of years began disappearing from large regions of the ocean. The coral-like organisms that built those reefs could not tolerate the unstable conditions spreading through their habitats. As they declined, the rich ecosystems that depended on them faded as well. Groups of animals that once dominated the seafloor also began vanishing. Trilobites, ancient arthropods that had crawled across marine sediments for hundreds of millions of years, declined sharply during this period. Brachiopods, which had once formed dense colonies along the seabed, became increasingly rare in many regions. Other early marine animals followed similar paths, their populations shrinking as oxygen. Poor waters spread across their habitats. Each disappearance weakened the web of life connecting the ocean's ecosystems. Food chains that had developed gradually over geological time began unraveling. Predators lost prey. Filter feeders lost stable currents carrying nutrients. Entire ecological networks collapsed as key species vanished from the system. Some organisms attempted to escape. Mobile species swam toward regions where oxygen remained available. Others migrated into shallower waters closer to the surface where circulation still delivered breathable conditions. Yet even these refuges were becoming unstable as environmental changes spread across the planet. Safe regions were growing scarce. For many species, the choices became painfully simple. Adapt to conditions that were growing increasingly toxic or disappear from the oceans entirely. The scale of the transformation was immense. This was not a localized disaster, confined to one coastline or a single ocean basin. Geological evidence from different continents reveals the same pattern unfolding across the world's seas. The crisis was global. Waters that once served as the cradle of life were becoming environments where survival was uncertain. Vast regions of the ocean floor were now dominated by microbial chemistry rather than complex ecosystems. For millions of years, the oceans had protected and sustained life on Earth. Now, in a bitter reversal, those same waters were becoming one of the most dangerous environments on the planet. And as ecosystems collapsed and extinction accelerated across the seas, scientists studying the rocks of this ancient era began uncovering evidence pointing toward the final stage of the crisis. An event so severe that it would nearly erase life from the oceans altogether. Eventually, the scattered warnings preserved in ancient sediments converge into a single, unmistakable moment in Earth's history. The gradual decline of species, the spreading anoxic waters, and the rise of toxic gases all lead toward a crisis that would push life closer to extinction than it had ever been before. Geological records reveal that this turning point occurred about 252 million years ago, during a catastrophe now known as the End Permian Extinction. Among scientists, it is sometimes called the Great Dying, a name that captures the scale of what unfolded during that distant chapter of Earth's story. By the time the crisis reached its peak, ecosystems across the oceans had already been weakened by millions of years of environmental stress. Oxygen levels had fallen across large regions of the sea. Toxic hydrogen sulfide had accumulated in deep waters. Volcanic eruptions on land continued releasing vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, warming the planet and disrupting the chemistry of the oceans. Each of these forces alone would have been difficult for life to endure. Together they formed a chain reaction that proved almost impossible to survive. As temperatures rose and oxygen declined, entire marine environments began collapsing across the globe. The fossil record shows a sudden disappearance of countless species that had dominated the oceans for ages. Trilobites, which had survived multiple, earlier extinction events, vanished completely from the planet. Brachiopods, reef builders, and many other ancient organisms declined so rapidly that their remains almost vanish from the geological record. Scientists estimate that as much as 90% of marine life disappeared during this event. To imagine that scale is difficult. Nearly every ecosystem beneath the waves was affected. Coral reefs collapsed. Seafloor communities vanished. Predators and prey alike disappeared from waters that had once been filled with life. The oceans, which had supported the majority of life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years, became places where survival itself was uncertain. Some regions may have resembled underwater deserts, their sediments nearly empty of the shells and fossils that normally accumulate in thriving ecosystems. Other areas were dominated by microbial life, where bacteria and chemical reactions replaced the complex biological networks that once flourished there. Yet even in this darkest moment, life did not disappear entirely. Hidden within scattered refuges across the planet, a small number of species endured the crisis. Some survived in shallow waters, where oxygen remained slightly higher. Others may have persisted in isolated basins where ocean circulation still delivered enough oxygen to sustain life. These survivors were not always the strongest or most complex organisms. In many cases, they were small, adaptable creatures capable of tolerating conditions that would have overwhelmed more specialized species. Their survival would prove crucial, because when the worst of the crisis finally passed, these few remaining organisms would become the seeds from which new ecosystems eventually grew. Extinction events often appear final when viewed through the lens of fossils and geological time. Entire groups of animals vanish, leaving only fragments of their history behind. Yet each extinction also reshapes the path of evolution. The disappearance of dominant species opens space for others to expand, adapt, and explore new ecological roles. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, the oceans were quieter, simpler, and far less diverse than before. But they were not empty. Life had survived its most severe test. And in the long ages that followed, those survivors would slowly begin rebuilding the living world from the ruins of the ancient seas. When the worst of the crisis finally passed, the oceans entered a strange and unfamiliar silence. For millions of years before the catastrophe, the seas had been crowded with life. Reefs stretched across warm continental shelves. The seafloor was layered with shells and burrows from countless organisms, feeding, crawling, and drifting through the water. Now much of that activity was gone. Large regions of the ocean had become eerily quiet. The reefs that once supported vibrant ecosystems had vanished from many places entirely. Sediments that normally preserved thick layers of fossil remains now contained only sparse traces of life. Entire groups of animals that had dominated the seas for ages were simply absent from the geological record. The ocean still covered most of the planet, but they were no longer the thriving cradle of biodiversity they had once been. For a time, the marine world was nearly empty, yet extinction had not erased life completely. Even during the darkest stages of the crisis, a small number of species managed to survive. These survivors were scattered across the planet in pockets, where conditions remained just tolerable enough to sustain life. Some lived in shallow coastal waters where waves and winds continued mixing oxygen into the sea. Others endured in regions where currents still carried faint traces of breathable water from distant basins. In a few rare places, environmental conditions may have remained relatively stable, providing small refuges where life could persist while the rest of the ocean struggled. The organisms that survived were not necessarily the largest or most powerful creatures of their time. Many of the dominant species that had ruled ancient ecosystems vanished completely. Instead, the survivors tended to be species capable of enduring unstable environments. Some could tolerate low oxygen levels for longer periods. Others possessed flexible diets that allowed them to survive even when food sources became scarce. A few were small, resilient animals able to reproduce quickly when conditions briefly improved. In the aftermath of the extinction, these modest survivors inherited a world that had been stripped of much of its complexity. Where once there had been dense reefs and bustling food chains, now vast stretches of ocean contained little competition. Predators were fewer. Ecosystems that had taken millions of years to develop had been reduced to fragile fragments. At first, the surviving species did not immediately rebuild the richness that had been lost. Recovery after such devastation moves slowly on geological timescales. Environmental systems must stabilize before complex ecosystems can form again. Oxygen levels in the oceans gradually began improving as circulation slowly returned. Toxic gases that had once filled deep waters dissipated over time. The chemical balance of the seas began drifting back toward conditions capable of sustaining a wider variety of life. Meanwhile, the survivors continued living in the quiet aftermath. Generation by generation, they reproduced and spread into the empty habitats surrounding them. Some expanded along the seafloor, where entire communities had vanished. Others drifted through open waters that had once been crowded with competing species. The oceans were still far from the vibrant ecosystems that had existed before the crisis. But the first fragile steps toward recovery had begun. These surviving organisms, scattered across the seas like scattered seeds after a storm, would become the foundation for a new chapter in the history of life. And as they slowly spread through the recovering oceans, evolution itself began to experiment with new possibilities, filling the empty spaces left behind by extinction. Recovery after an extinction on the scale of the Great Dying did not arrive quickly. The oceans had lost much of their complexity, and the delicate systems that once supported diverse ecosystems needed time to return. For a long while, the seas remained quiet compared to the vibrant environments that had existed before the catastrophe. Yet beneath that quiet surface, change was already beginning. With so many species gone, the ocean had been left with countless empty spaces. Ecologists call these spaces ecological niches, roles within an ecosystem that determine how organisms live, feed, and interact with one another. Before the extinction, these niches had been filled by a wide variety of specialized species. After the crisis, many of them stood vacant. The survivors that remain now had an opportunity that rarely appears in the history of life. They could expand. Small, adaptable organisms began spreading into environments that had once been crowded with competitors. Species that had previously occupied only narrow habitats found themselves able to explore new parts of the ocean. With fewer predators and less competition for food, their populations slowly grew. This expansion did not restore the oceans overnight. Instead, the early stages of recovery were marked by simplicity. Marine ecosystems during this time were dominated by relatively small, opportunistic animals capable of surviving in unstable conditions. Many of these organisms possessed flexible lifestyles. They could tolerate changes in oxygen levels. They could feed on a variety of food sources. Some reproduced rapidly, allowing their populations to recover quickly after environmental disturbances. Gradually, the seas began filling with life again. Eerily reef structures slowly reappeared in shallow waters, though they looked very different from the reefs that had existed before the extinction. The complex coral systems of earlier ages had largely vanished, and the organisms that began building new reefs were often simpler in structure. These early reefs served as the first signs that marine ecosystems were rebuilding their foundations. But the path of recovery was not smooth or predictable. Fossil evidence from this period reveals an ocean filled with unusual creatures. Many species appeared briefly in the geological record, before disappearing again after only a few million years. These short-lived organisms represent evolutionary experiments, forms of life exploring ecological opportunities that had not existed before. Some of these experiments succeeded, giving rise to new groups that would dominate the oceans in later eras. Others vanished as environmental conditions continued shifting. In this way, evolution behaves almost like a quiet sculptor working with living material. When extinction clears away the old forms, the remaining organisms begin testing new possibilities. Some shapes endure, others fade, leaving only faint traces in the fossil record. Over long spans of time, these experiments gradually produced more stable ecosystems. Predators returned to the seas in greater numbers. Grazers and filter feeders multiplied. Food webs slowly became more intricate as new relationships formed between species that had never coexisted before. Generation by generation, life continued spreading through the recovering oceans. Yet the seas that emerged from this process were not simply a restoration of the world that had been lost. Entire branches of ancient life had vanished forever, leaving evolutionary pathways permanently altered. The oceans were being rebuilt, but they were also becoming something new. And as scientists studied the rocks preserving this long recovery, they began searching for deeper clues hidden within those layers. Evidence that might reveal exactly how the ancient oceans had once transformed into the toxic world that nearly ended life in the seas. The story of the ancient oceans might have remained unknown, if not for the quiet testimony preserved in stone. Long after the creatures of those distant seas vanished, the sediments beneath them hardened into rock, carrying with them a subtle record of what the planet once endured. Today, scientists read those layers the way historians read old manuscripts, searching for faint signals that reveal how the oceans changed across deep time. Every year, researchers travel to remote cliffs, desert outcrops, and mountain ranges where ancient seafloors have been lifted high above the land. In those exposed layers of rock, the past lies stacked like pages in a book, written over hundreds of millions of years. Each thin band of sediment contains traces of the environment that existed when it was first deposited on the ocean floor. At first glance, these rocks appear silent and ordinary, but inside them are clues that reveal remarkable details about the chemistry of ancient seas. One of the most powerful tools scientists use is the study of isotopes, slightly different forms of elements such as carbon and sulfur. These variations behave in predictable ways during biological and chemical processes. When organisms grow, decay, or interact with the surrounding environment, they leave subtle isotopic signatures behind. By analyzing these patterns preserved in ancient sediments, researchers can reconstruct the conditions that once existed in the ocean. For example, certain minerals form only when oxygen levels are extremely low. These minerals appear repeatedly in rock layers dating to periods when the oceans were under severe environmental stress. Their presence suggests that large portions of the seafloor were once covered by anoxic waters where complex marine life could no longer survive. In some cases, scientists find evidence pointing to an even more unusual state of the ocean. Layers rich in particular sulfur compounds indicate the presence of hydrogen sulfide in seawater. These chemical fingerprints are consistent with conditions where sulfate, reducing bacteria dominated the marine environment, producing toxic gases in waters that had lost nearly all oxygen. Such discoveries reveal that the toxic oceans described in earlier chapters were not theoretical possibilities. They were real environments that once existed on this planet. Microscopic fossils provide another important piece of the puzzle. Certain microorganisms thrive in oxygen, poor conditions, and their remains can sometimes be preserved in sediments. When scientists examine these microfossils under powerful microscopes, they occasionally find entire communities of organisms associated with low oxygen ecosystems. The presence of these tiny fossils in specific rock layers suggests that microbial life once dominated large portions of the ocean. In other words, the seas may have temporarily reverted to a state resembling much earlier periods in Earth's history, when complex animals had not yet become widespread. Taken together, these clues allow researchers to reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture of the ancient oceans. They reveal how oxygen levels declined, how microbial populations expanded, and how toxic chemicals accumulated in the depths of the sea. Yet the story continues to evolve. Modern laboratories now use technologies capable of measuring chemical signatures at incredibly small scales. Instruments can detect trace elements embedded in crystals, no larger than grains of sand. With each new discovery, scientists refine their understanding of how these ancient crises unfolded. Every fossil, every sediment layer, and every chemical signature adds another fragment to a puzzle that spans hundreds of millions of years. What once seemed like isolated extinction events now appears to be part of a complex interplay between geology, chemistry, and life itself. And as this picture becomes clearer, another realization has begun to emerge. The conditions that once turned the oceans toxic may not belong entirely to the distant past. For much of this story, the events shaping the oceans have belonged to a distant world, an Earth so ancient that its continents looked unfamiliar and its creatures no longer exist. It might be comforting to imagine that those toxic seas and collapsing ecosystems belong only to a remote chapter of planetary history. But the forces that created them did not disappear. They remain part of the living system of Earth today. The oceans still breathe through the same delicate balance of temperature, circulation and chemistry that governed them hundreds of millions of years ago. Winds still stir the surface waters. Deep currents. Nutrients still drift upward to feed the countless microscopic organisms that support marine food webs. Yet in recent decades, scientists have begun noticing subtle changes that echo processes recorded in the ancient rock layers. One of the clearest examples appears along certain coastlines around the world, where regions of water have begun losing oxygen at alarming rates. These areas are known as dead zones, places where oxygen levels drop so low that most marine animals cannot survive for long. In these waters, fish often flee if they can. Shellfish and other bottom-dwelling creatures are less fortunate. Without sufficient oxygen, many of them simply perish. Dead zones usually begin with an explosion of life. Rivers carry nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus from farmland and cities into the sea. These nutrients act like fertilizer once they reach coastal waters, triggering enormous blooms of algae across the surface. At first, the ocean appears to flourish. The water becomes thick with microscopic life drifting in sunlight. But when the algae die, their bodies sink. As they decompose, bacteria consume oxygen from the surrounding water. If enough organic material accumulates, oxygen levels can fall dramatically, leaving the deeper layers of the ocean starved of the gas that most marine life requires. In these moments, the ocean briefly resembles the ancient environments described earlier in this story. Large areas of the seafloor become nearly uninhabitable. Animals either escape or vanish. Fortunately, most modern dead zones remain relatively small compared to the vast anoxic oceans of the distant past. They are often temporary, shrinking or disappearing when currents shift or nutrient input declines. Yet they reveal something important about how marine systems behave. Under the right conditions, oxygen can disappear from ocean waters surprisingly quickly. Scientists studying these phenomena have begun looking more closely at the broader patterns shaping the modern ocean. Rising global temperatures are warming surface waters in many regions, making them less likely to mix with deeper layers below. In some places, this stratification weakens the natural circulation that carries oxygen into the depths. At the same time, nutrient runoff from rivers and coastal development continues increasing in many parts of the world. These changes are not identical to the conditions that once produced the toxic oceans of deep time. The scale is far smaller, and modern ecosystems remain far more resilient than those that faced the Great Dying. Yet the similarities are difficult to ignore. The same processes that once transformed ancient seas, warming water, weakened circulation, and oxygen depletion, are still operating within Earth's oceans today. For scientists studying the geological record, this connection offers both insight and caution. Because when researchers compare modern ocean conditions with the evidence preserved in ancient rocks, they begin to see patterns that feel strangely familiar. The rocks that record Earth's ancient oceans are more than relics of a distant past. To scientists who study them, they are part of an enormous natural laboratory, one that has been running experiments for hundreds of millions of years. Within those layers of stone lies a record of how life and climate have responded to some of the most dramatic environmental changes the planet has ever experienced. Geologists and oceanographers often speak of deep time when describing these ancient events. The phrase refers to timescales so vast that human history becomes almost invisible by comparison. Civilizations rise and fall within a few thousand years, yet the transformations preserved in the fossil record unfold across millions. This long perspective allows scientists to observe patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. By examining ancient ocean crises, researchers can see how ecosystems behave under extreme stress. They can trace how oxygen levels changed, how microbial life expanded, and how complex marine communities weakened before major extinctions occurred. Each sediment layer becomes a fragment of evidence, showing how the planet's systems responded to pressures building slowly beneath the surface. One of the most important lessons from these ancient oceans is how gradually environmental change can unfold. In many cases, ecosystems appear stable for long periods, even while underlying conditions shift quietly in the background. Oxygen levels may decline slowly. Ocean circulation may weaken little by little. Climate patterns may adjust by small increments that seem harmless on their own. Life continues adapting during these early stages, and the overall system appears resilient. Yet, beneath that appearance of stability, the environment may be drifting closer to a threshold. The fossil record shows that once certain tipping points are crossed, changes that once unfolded slowly can accelerate dramatically. Oxygen levels that declined gradually for millions of years may collapse in a relatively short span of geological time. Microbial populations may suddenly dominate environments that once supported complex ecosystems. What makes these tipping points so important is that they are often difficult to detect until they have already been reached. This realization has shaped the way scientists study both ancient and modern oceans. Researchers now focus not only on individual factors such as temperature or oxygen levels, but also on how different systems interact with one another. Ocean circulation influences oxygen distribution. Atmospheric chemistry affects ocean temperature. Biological activity can reshape the chemistry of entire marine environments. When these systems interact, small changes can sometimes produce surprisingly large effects. By studying ancient extinction events, scientists gain insight into how these complex interactions unfold over time. The fossil record reveals how volcanic activity, climate shifts, ocean stagnation, and biological feedback loops once combined to produce dramatic environmental transformations. These discoveries are now helping researchers build models that explore how modern oceans might respond to similar pressures in the future. Yet the lessons of deep time are not only warnings. They also tell a story of resilience. Again and again, life has faced enormous environmental challenges. Asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, climate upheavals, and toxic oceans have reshaped the planet repeatedly. Each time, ecosystems have collapsed, species have vanished, and the living world has been forced to rebuild itself from a handful of survivors. And each time, life has returned in new and unexpected forms. The oceans that exist today are the result of those long cycles of destruction and recovery. Their ecosystems carry the legacy of countless ancient crises that reshaped the course of evolution. The rocks beneath our feet remind us that Earth's history is not simply a record of disaster. It is also a story of endurance. Yet every recovery leaves the planet changed in ways that could never have been predicted beforehand. And as this long journey through ancient oceans approaches its final chapter, one question quietly emerges from the depths of that history. What do these forgotten crises reveal about the fragile balance that allows life to exist on Earth today? When the story of Earth's ancient oceans is viewed across the immense scale of deep time, the events described in earlier chapters begin to take on a different meaning. The quiet disappearance of oxygen, the spread of toxic waters, and the collapse of marine ecosystems were not isolated disturbances. They were moments when the balance sustaining life across the planet came dangerously close to breaking. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the oceans that covered most of Earth nearly lost the complex life they had nurtured for ages. At the height of the crisis, vast regions of the sea had become hostile environments. Oxygen had vanished from deep basins, toxic gases filled stagnant waters, reef systems collapsed, and food chains that once supported countless species unraveled across the globe. To creatures living through that era, the oceans must have seemed increasingly uncertain. Habitats that had remained stable for millions of years were changing in ways no organism had ever experienced before. Entire ecosystems disappeared. Yet even as the crisis spread across the seas, life did not vanish entirely. Hidden within scattered refuges, small populations of resilient organisms managed to endure the changing conditions. Some survived in shallow coastal waters where waves and winds continued mixing oxygen into the sea. Others persisted in isolated basins where currents still carried faint traces of breathable water. These survivors were few in number, and their world had been reduced to fragments of what once existed. But survival, even in its smallest form, carries powerful consequences across geological time. Once the worst conditions began to fade, those scattered survivors slowly expanded into the empty oceans surrounding them. Generation by generation, they spread into habitats where earlier species had vanished. Over millions of years, their descendants formed entirely new ecosystems, reshaping the living world in ways that could never have been predicted during the darkest moments of the crisis. The oceans recovered, but they were never exactly the same again. Extinction events permanently alter the path of evolution. When dominant species disappear, they leave behind ecological space that new organisms eventually fill. The marine ecosystems that emerged after the ancient toxic oceans were built from different foundations than those that had existed before. In this way, catastrophe became part of the creative force that shapes life on Earth. The deeper lesson hidden in this history is not simply that oceans can change. It is that they are always changing. The seas appear timeless when viewed across the span of a human life. Waves continue breaking against the same shorelines. Tides rise and fall in rhythms that seem eternal. Yet beneath that familiar surface lies a system constantly shaped by forces both visible and hidden. Climate alters the temperature of the water. Continents drift across the planet, redirecting ocean currents. Volcanic activity reshapes the chemistry of the atmosphere. Life itself changes the composition of the sea through the endless cycle of growth and decay. All of these influences interact across timescales so vast that they are difficult to imagine. The ancient toxic oceans remind us that even the most stable environments can transform under the right conditions. They show how delicate the balance of Earth's living systems truly is. But they also reveal something remarkable about the nature of life itself. Again and again, across hundreds of millions of years, life has survived challenges far greater than anything humanity has ever witnessed. Ecosystems have collapsed, climates have shifted, and entire branches of the evolutionary tree have vanished. Yet life has always returned. The oceans that exist today are the result of those countless cycles of destruction and renewal. Every coral reef, every drifting plankton cell, and every fish swimming through modern seas carries a lineage shaped by crises that unfolded long before humans appeared on Earth. And as scientists continue studying this deep history, another mystery quietly emerges from the evidence. These toxic ocean events did not occur only once. They appear again and again across the planet's geological record. For a long time, scientists believed the ancient toxic oceans described in earlier chapters represented rare and extraordinary moments in Earth's history. The Great Dying at the end of the Permian period seemed almost unimaginable in its scale. A singular catastrophe when life in the oceans came close to disappearing altogether. But as researchers continued studying rock formations across different continents, a surprising pattern began to appear. The signs of oxygen-starved oceans were not limited to a single moment in geological time. Instead, they appeared again and again. Sediment layers from many different ages reveal similar chemical fingerprints. In each case, the clues point toward a familiar sequence of events: oxygen levels falling in deep waters, microbial populations expanding, and marine ecosystems weakening under environmental stress. These patterns are preserved in rocks formed hundreds of millions of years apart, scattered across regions that once belonged to completely different ancient oceans. At first, the connections were difficult to recognize. Individual discoveries seemed isolated, each tied to its own geological era and environmental conditions. But as more data accumulated from around the world, the similarities became harder to ignore. The oceans had experienced multiple episodes of oxygen collapse. Scientists now refer to many of these events as oceanic anoxic events, periods when large portions of the sea lost oxygen and marine ecosystems were dramatically disrupted. Some of these events were smaller than the crisis at the end of the Permian, while others approached similar levels of environmental upheaval. Each episode unfolded differently, yet the underlying pattern remained strikingly consistent. For long stretches of time, the oceans existed in stable conditions. Currents circulated freely across the globe. Oxygen flowed from the surface into the deep sea. Marine ecosystems flourished, and biodiversity slowly increased as new species evolved and spread through the water. Then something changed. Circulation began to weaken. Oxygen levels declined in deeper waters. Microbial communities expanded in environments where complex animals once thrived. These chemical shifts often remained hidden for thousands of years before finally becoming severe enough to affect entire ecosystems. Once the balance tipped far enough, marine life began struggling to survive. These repeating patterns force scientists to reconsider how Earth's environmental systems operate across deep time. Instead of viewing toxic oceans as isolated disasters triggered by rare circumstances, researchers began asking a more intriguing question. What if the oceans naturally pass through cycles of stability and instability? In this view, long periods of flourishing life represent phases when ocean circulation and atmospheric chemistry remain balanced. Oxygen moves freely through the sea, supporting complex ecosystems across vast regions of the planet. But under certain planetary conditions, that balance begins to unravel. The changes may begin quietly. Slower currents, warming temperatures, shifts in nutrient flows. Over time, those subtle pressures accumulate until the chemistry of the oceans begins shifting toward oxygen depletion and microbial dominance. For a while, the transformation remains hidden beneath the surface. Then the crisis appears suddenly in the fossil record. This realization has reshaped how scientists interpret Earth's geological history. The toxic oceans of the past no longer appear as singular catastrophes, but as recurring phases in the planet's long environmental story. And if these events have occurred multiple times before, a deeper mystery emerges from the evidence. What forces inside the Earth are powerful enough to push the oceans toward such transformations again and again? To understand why the oceans sometimes drift toward instability, scientists often look not only at the sea itself, but at the land surrounding it. The continents may seem like silent backdrops to the story of life, yet their slow movement across the planet has repeatedly reshaped the behavior of the oceans. Earth's outer shell is divided into enormous tectonic plates that drift gradually over the molten mantle below. The motion is so slow that it escapes notice in everyday life. A continent may move only a few centimeters in a year, but across hundreds of millions of years, that quiet movement rearranges the entire surface of the planet. Oceans open and close. Mountain ranges rise where plates collide. Vast landmasses gather together and later break apart again. During certain periods of Earth's history, these drifting continents assemble into enormous supercontinents. Instead of being scattered across the globe, most of the planet's land becomes concentrated in one immense mass, surrounded by a single global ocean. These supercontinents dramatically alter how the oceans behave. Ocean currents depend on open pathways. They move heat from the equator toward the poles, carry nutrients across vast distances, and transport oxygen from the surface into the depths. When continents cluster together, those pathways become restricted or redirected. Entire ocean basins may become partially isolated from the global circulation that once refreshed them. In some regions, vast inland seas form between the arms of the supercontinent. These shallow basins can become warm and stagnant, especially if surrounding landmasses block the winds that normally stir the surface waters. Without strong mixing, oxygen from the atmosphere struggles to penetrate deeper layers of the sea. Over time, these enclosed or semi-isolated waters can begin losing oxygen. The deeper basins are particularly vulnerable. As circulation slows, the oxygen carried into those depths becomes limited. Organic material drifting down from the surface continues feeding microbial life, and as bacteria consume that material, they gradually remove the remaining oxygen from the water. The conditions described earlier in this story, anoxic waters, microbial dominance, and the buildup of toxic gases, can begin forming once again. Supercontinents also influence the oceans in another important way. When vast landmasses gather together, Weather patterns and erosion processes change dramatically. Rivers carry minerals and nutrients from the interior of the continents toward the sea. These nutrients can fertilize surface waters, encouraging enormous blooms of microscopic organisms. At first, such blooms may appear beneficial. The ocean fills with drifting life, and productivity increases. Yet when those organisms die, they sink into deeper waters where decomposition consumes oxygen. In stagnant basins, the result can accelerate the loss of oxygen already underway. Geological records reveal an intriguing connection between these processes. Several ancient oceanic anoxic events appear during periods when continents were clustered together into supercontinents. The timing suggests that the arrangement of land across the planet may influence how easily the oceans circulate and breathe. In other words, the position of the continents may help determine whether the seas remain stable or drift toward chemical imbalance. It is a reminder that Earth's systems are deeply interconnected. The movement of land across the surface of the planet can quietly influence the chemistry of oceans, thousands of kilometers away. Yet while continental drift reshapes the oceans over immense spans of time, another force operates with greater intensity. Deep within the planet, energy continues building beneath the crust. Energy that has repeatedly erupted onto the surface and transformed Earth's environment with surprising speed. Even the slow gathering of continents into supercontinents does not fully explain why the oceans sometimes drift toward crisis. Tectonic movement alters the shape of the planet over millions of years. Yet many environmental upheavals appear to unfold more abruptly than continental drift alone would suggest. To understand those sudden turns in Earth's history, scientists often look deeper, far beneath the crust, where enormous reservoirs of molten rock continue moving through the mantle. From time to time, the energy stored in those depths reaches the surface in extraordinary ways. These events are known as large igneous provinces, and they represent some of the most powerful volcanic episodes in the history of the planet. Unlike a typical volcano that erupts from a single mountain, these eruptions occur across vast regions of land. The crust cracks open along long fractures, and lava pours outward in enormous flows that can continue for hundreds of thousands of years. Entire landscapes become buried beneath layers of molten rock. But the lava itself is only part of the transformation. Each eruption releases enormous volumes of gases, trapped deep within the Earth. Carbon dioxide escapes into the atmosphere along with methane and sulfur compounds. Individually, these gases might seem insignificant, but over long periods they accumulate until the atmosphere begins to change. Carbon dioxide traps heat, slowly warming the planet. Methane amplifies that warming even further. As temperatures rise, the oceans respond in ways that echo the ancient crises described earlier in this story. Warm water becomes more stable than cold water, forming layers that resist mixing. The deep ocean begins losing its connection with the surface, and oxygen circulation weakens. In this quieter, stratified ocean, the supply of oxygen reaching the depths becomes limited. At the same time, volcanic activity can alter the chemistry of seawater in subtle but important ways. Nutrients washed from newly formed volcanic rock enter rivers and eventually flow into the sea. These nutrients can stimulate enormous blooms of plankton across the surface waters. For a moment, the ocean appears rich with life. Yet the same process that feeds these blooms also accelerates oxygen loss below. As plankton die and sink, bacteria break down their remains, consuming oxygen in the deeper layers of the sea. If circulation is already weak, the lost oxygen cannot be easily replaced. Conditions begin to resemble the environments that once allowed sulfate, reducing bacteria to thrive. With oxygen depleted and organic material abundant, microbial activity intensifies. Chemical reactions within the water column shift toward processes that produce hydrogen sulfide, slowly transforming deep waters into toxic reservoirs. Once again, the combination of warming oceans, declining oxygen, and microbial chemistry creates a dangerous feedback loop. Each factor strengthens the others. Rising temperatures weaken circulation, reduced circulation accelerates oxygen loss. Microbial activity produces compounds that further destabilize marine ecosystems. Over time, entire regions of the ocean can drift toward the same conditions that once nearly erased life from the seas. When scientists examine the geological record, they often find that many oceanic anoxic events and extinction crises occur at roughly the same time as these immense volcanic episodes. The pattern suggests that the forces reshaping the oceans do not originate in a single place. Instead, they emerge from the interaction of systems operating across the entire planet. The oceans respond to heat rising from deep within the Earth. The atmosphere changes as volcanic gases accumulate. Marine ecosystems shift as circulation patterns alter the chemistry of the sea. Earth behaves less like a collection of separate environments and more like a vast network where geology, climate, and life continuously influence one another. Sometimes the chain of interactions remains balanced for millions of years. At other times, the system drifts toward instability. And when that happens, the consequences can echo across the entire planet. If the toxic oceans described in this story emerge from the interplay of such planetary forces, one final question begins to surface from the evidence. Could similar conditions ever emerge again? When we look out across the oceans today, they appear vast, steady, and endlessly alive. Waves roll toward distant shores in rhythms that seem unchanged for centuries. Beneath the surface, coral reefs shelter thousands of species. Schools of fish move through shifting currents, and microscopic plankton drift quietly through sunlit waters. To most observers, the seas feel permanent, as though they have always functioned this way and always will. Yet the deeper story told by ancient rocks suggests something different. The stability of the oceans is not guaranteed. It depends on a delicate balance of processes that must operate continuously for life to flourish beneath the waves. Modern oceans breathe through the slow movement of water across the globe. Winds blowing across the surface push vast currents that travel thousands of kilometers before changing direction. In colder regions near the poles, dense water sinks into the depths, carrying oxygen with it. Far away, that deep water slowly rises again, bringing nutrients back toward the surface. This circulation links every ocean basin into a single connected system. The process unfolds so gradually that most people never notice it. The currents that sustain marine ecosystems move silently beneath the surface, redistributing heat, oxygen, and nutrients around the planet. Without this constant movement, the oceans would behave very differently. Oxygen from the atmosphere would struggle to reach deeper waters. Nutrients would accumulate in some regions while disappearing from others. The complex food webs that depend on balanced chemistry would begin to unravel. Fortunately, the modern oceans maintain this circulation with remarkable consistency. Cold water sinks in polar regions, particularly in the North Atlantic and near Antarctica. That sinking motion draws surface water downward, carrying oxygen into the depths. Over time, the deep water spreads across the ocean floor before eventually rising again in distant parts of the world. The entire cycle may take hundreds or even thousands of years to complete. Yet this slow breathing of the sea supports nearly every marine ecosystem on Earth. What the ancient record reminds us, however, is that this system can change. Temperature influences how easily ocean layers mix. Warmer water tends to remain near the surface, forming stable layers that resist vertical movement. If these layers strengthen, the circulation that carries oxygen into the deep ocean may weaken. Nutrients also play an important role. When excess nutrients enter marine environments, they can fuel enormous blooms of microscopic organisms. These blooms may appear beneficial at first, but when the organisms die and decompose, they consume oxygen in the surrounding water. Atmospheric chemistry adds another layer of complexity. Changes in the composition of the atmosphere can influence global temperatures, rainfall patterns, and the flow of nutrients from land to sea. Each of these factors interacts with the others. The result is a system that functions beautifully when its components remain balanced, but can shift in unexpected ways when those relationships change. Scientists studying modern ocean circulation often approach their work with a sense of quiet respect for this complexity. They understand that the conditions sustaining marine life today did not appear by accident. They are the product of countless interacting processes that have evolved across deep time. The same natural forces that shaped ancient ocean crises still exist within Earth's system. Understanding how they work allows researchers to appreciate just how delicate the balance of the oceans truly is. And as scientists compare modern observations with the geological record, they are beginning to notice patterns that feel strangely familiar. In several places around the world today, small regions of the ocean have already stopped breathing. They are known as dead zones, though the name can be misleading. These waters are not completely lifeless, but they contain so little oxygen that most fish, shellfish, and other marine animals cannot survive there for long. From the surface, these areas often look no different from the surrounding sea. The water may appear calm and blue, sunlight still reaching down through the upper layers. Yet beneath that familiar surface, the chemistry of the ocean has quietly shifted. In these regions, oxygen levels have fallen so low that the balance sustaining marine ecosystems begins to unravel. Many of the world's modern dead zones appear near coastlines where rivers carry nutrients from land into the sea. Fertilizers from agriculture, Runoff from cities and natural erosion all deliver nitrogen and phosphorus into coastal waters. Once there, these nutrients act like powerful fertilizer for microscopic algae drifting near the surface. The result can be an enormous bloom of life. At first, the bloom appears beneficial. The ocean fills with drifting organisms capturing sunlight and multiplying rapidly, but the bloom cannot last forever. When the algae die, their remains begin sinking through the water column toward the seafloor. Bacteria quickly move in to break down this organic material. As they do, they consume oxygen from the surrounding water. If the bloom was large enough, the amount of decomposing material can overwhelm the available oxygen supply. The deeper layers of water gradually become depleted, leaving conditions where fish struggle to breathe, and many bottom-dwelling organisms cannot survive at all. Creatures capable of swimming often flee these zones. Those tied to the seafloor rarely escape. In the modern world, these oxygen-poor environments remain relatively small compared to the immense anoxic oceans of deep time. Some form seasonally and disappear when currents strengthen or temperatures cool. Others persist for longer periods, particularly in enclosed coastal regions where circulation is limited. Yet scientists have noticed something concerning over the past few decades. The number of documented dead zones has been growing. Marine researchers studying global ocean health have identified hundreds of oxygen-depleted areas across different seas and coastlines. In some cases, these zones have expanded in size, covering large portions of continental shelves that once supported thriving fisheries and marine ecosystems. Temperature plays an important role in this process. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than colder water. As ocean temperatures rise, the ability of seawater to retain oxygen gradually declines. At the same time, warming can strengthen the layering of ocean waters, making it harder for surface winds to mix oxygen-rich water downward. The result is an environment where oxygen becomes easier to lose and harder to replace. Scientists studying ancient ocean crises recognize these mechanisms immediately. The same combination of nutrient enrichment, microbial activity, and weakened circulation appears again and again in the geological record. In the past, those processes sometimes unfolded on far larger scales, transforming entire ocean basins into oxygen-starved environments. Today's dead zones remain far smaller than those ancient catastrophes. Still, they provide valuable insight into how marine ecosystems respond when oxygen begins to disappear. They reveal how quickly environmental conditions can shift when the chemistry of the ocean changes. Each modern dead zone is like a small window into processes that have shaped the oceans for millions of years. They remind scientists that the chemistry of seawater is not fixed. It responds constantly to the forces acting upon it: temperature, nutrients, circulation, and life itself. And as researchers continue studying both modern oceans and ancient rocks, a deeper realization begins to emerge. The story of toxic seas is not only about catastrophe. It is also about the long and complex relationship between life and the planet that sustains it. If the oceans could speak, their story would stretch far beyond the reach of human memory. Long before the first forests appeared on land, long before animals walked across continents, or humans began studying the sea, the oceans were already shaping the destiny of life on Earth. For billions of years they have acted as the planet's great laboratory. Within their waters, life first emerged from simple chemistry into living cells. Over immense spans of time, those early organisms evolved into increasingly complex forms. Ecosystems grew richer and more intricate. Creatures adapted to every corner of the marine world, from the sunlit shallows to the darkest depths of the sea floor. Yet the history of the oceans has never been one of uninterrupted growth. Again and again, the balance supporting marine life has shifted. Climate changes have altered ocean temperatures. Continents have drifted across the surface of the planet, reshaping currents and coastlines. Volcanic eruptions have transformed the atmosphere, sending ripples through the chemistry of the seas. At times, those forces pushed the oceans toward conditions that nearly erased the complex ecosystems they had nurtured for hundreds of millions of years. The toxic oceans described earlier in this story represent some of the most dramatic of those moments. Vast regions of water lost their oxygen. Microbial chemistry replaced the biological diversity that once flourished there. Entire branches of life disappeared from the planet, leaving behind only fragments of their existence preserved in rock. From a human perspective, such events feel almost unimaginable. Yet they are written clearly within the geological record. The rocks beneath mountains, deserts, and coastlines hold chemical signatures that reveal when the oceans changed and how life responded. Each sediment layer carries traces of the environment that existed when it formed, preserving a memory of seas that once looked very different from those we know today. These records remind us that the stability of the oceans is not permanent. The seas that appear calm and enduring in the present are part of a system that has shifted many times throughout Earth's history. Under certain conditions, the chemistry of the ocean can transform in ways that challenge the survival of the creatures living within it. But the same history also reveals something equally remarkable. Life has endured every crisis the oceans have faced. When ecosystems collapsed, a handful of species survived. When toxic waters spread across the seafloor, small communities of organisms found ways to persist. Generation by generation, those survivors slowly rebuilt the living world from the fragments that remained. The oceans that exist today are the result of those long cycles of loss and recovery. Every coral reef rising toward the sunlight carries the legacy of ancient reefs that vanished long ago. Every fish swimming through modern currents belongs to a lineage that survived challenges far greater than anything humanity has ever witnessed. Even the tiniest plankton drifting through the water today represents an unbroken chain of life, stretching back through countless environmental upheavals. The oceans remember all of it. They remember the flourishing ecosystems of distant eras and the silent periods that followed extinction. They remember the times when life nearly disappeared and the slow recoveries that eventually restored the seas. By studying these ancient events, scientists gain more than knowledge of the past. They gain insight into the nature of the planet itself. Earth is not a static world. It is a dynamic system where geology, climate, chemistry, and life constantly interact. Change is woven into the fabric of the planet, shaping the environment in ways that unfold across timescales far longer than human history. The oceans we see today are simply the latest chapter in that unfolding story. And as the final chapters of this journey approach, the lessons hidden in those ancient seas offer a deeper understanding of both the resilience of life and the fragile balance that allows it to exist. When the worst of the ancient crisis finally faded, the oceans did not suddenly return to the vibrant worlds they had once been. The catastrophe had left a profound silence across much of the planet's seas. Ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve were gone, and the living networks that once filled the oceans had been reduced to scattered remnants. In the aftermath, Earth entered a strange and unfamiliar era. The seas still stretched across most of the planet, their waves rising and falling beneath the same sun. But beneath that familiar surface, the living world had been dramatically simplified. Vast regions of the ocean floor that once hosted dense communities of organisms now contained only a few hardy survivors. Reefs that had once supported extraordinary biodiversity had largely vanished. Without their towering structures of coral-like organisms, many species lost the habitats they depended on for shelter and food. Fish populations declined. Filter feeders that once lined the seafloor were scarce. The intricate food chains that once linked countless creatures together had collapsed into far simpler systems. The oceans were not empty, but they had become quieter. To imagine these seas is to picture an environment that felt strangely subdued compared to the thriving ecosystems of earlier ages. Where once entire reefs pulsed with life, now scattered organisms occupied wide stretches of seafloor. Where predators once patrolled rich hunting grounds, now fewer species moved through the water. For millions of years the pace of change remained slow. Fossil evidence from this period shows that biodiversity recovered only gradually. The living world could not immediately rebuild the complexity that had been lost. After such a massive environmental shock, the planet's systems required time to stabilize. Ocean circulation, which had been weakened during the crisis, slowly began improving. As climate shifted and volcanic activity declined, currents strengthened once again. Water from the surface gradually carried oxygen back into deeper layers of the sea. The chemical balance of the oceans also began to change. Hydrogen sulfide that once accumulated in stagnant waters dissipated as circulation returned. Oxygen levels increased across many regions of the seafloor, creating conditions where complex marine life could once again survive. Yet recovery remained slow. Mass extinction events leave scars that persist long after the immediate catastrophe has passed. The organisms that vanish during such crises cannot simply reappear. Evolution must build new ecosystems step by step, generation after generation. This process unfolds on timescales far longer than human experience. What might seem like an eternity to civilizations, thousands of years, represents only a brief moment in the recovery of a planet after extinction. For the oceans of this ancient era, rebuilding would require millions of years of gradual change. Still, even within this simplified marine world, The first signs of renewal were beginning to appear. The surviving organisms that endured the crisis slowly expanded into the empty habitats surrounding them. Small communities formed along the seafloor where oxygen had returned. Plankton once again drifted through surface waters in increasing numbers, providing food for the few animals that remained. These were modest beginnings. Yet within these quiet steps lay the foundations of a future ocean. Life, even in its most fragile state, possesses a remarkable ability to rebuild, and as environmental conditions continued stabilizing across the recovering seas, those scattered survivors would soon begin exploring the countless ecological opportunities left behind by extinction. When extinction removes the dominant inhabitants of an ecosystem, it leaves behind something unusual: opportunity. The oceans that followed the Great Crisis were not only quieter and simpler, they were also filled with empty ecological space. Countless roles within the marine world, predators, grazers, filter feeders, and reef builders, had been left unoccupied. For the few species that survived, the recovering seas offered possibilities that had not existed for millions of years. In the long aftermath of the catastrophe, evolution began its slow work again. The survivors that endured the toxic oceans were rarely the most powerful creatures of the ancient world. Instead, they were often small, adaptable organisms capable of tolerating unstable conditions. Some could survive with lower oxygen levels than their vanished competitors. Others possessed flexible diets that allowed them to feed on whatever food remained available. These traits, once modest advantages, now became powerful tools for survival. With fewer rivals and predators, the descendants of these resilient species gradually spread through the recovering oceans. Generation by generation, their populations expanded into habitats that had once been crowded with other forms of life. The seafloor, once lined with diverse communities, slowly welcomed new inhabitants. At first, the ecosystems remained simple, but simplicity rarely lasts long in a living world. As time passed, small differences between individuals began shaping new evolutionary paths. Some species adapted to hunt in waters where predators had disappeared. Others developed new feeding strategies to take advantage of food sources that had once been overlooked. Natural selection quietly favored traits that allowed organisms to explore these newly available roles. The fossil record from this early recovery period reveals an ocean filled with experimentation. Many creatures appearing in the rocks of this era look unfamiliar compared to the animals that existed before the extinction. Some possessed unusual body shapes or feeding structures, suggesting that evolution was testing new possibilities. Not all of these experiments endured. Certain species flourished briefly before vanishing again after only a few million years. Others adapted more successfully, eventually giving rise to entirely new groups of marine organisms that would dominate later ecosystems. This process is one of the defining patterns of life on Earth. Evolution does not simply rebuild what has been lost. Instead, it reshapes the living world in unexpected ways. When extinction removes established species, it clears the stage for new forms of life to explore opportunities that were previously unavailable. Over long spans of time, these changes accumulate. The oceans that emerged from the ancient toxic crisis gradually filled with creatures very different from those that had once inhabited the seas. New predators evolved to replace those that had disappeared. New reef-building organisms began constructing habitats that supported expanding ecosystems. Even the smallest organisms, plankton drifting through sunlit waters, continued evolving, influencing the chemistry and food webs of the ocean in subtle ways. Step by step, the seas became more complex again. Food chains lengthened as predators returned to the water. Seafloor communities grew denser. Marine ecosystems regained the diversity that had once been nearly erased. Yet the new oceans were not identical to the ones that had existed before the catastrophe. Entire branches of ancient life had vanished permanently. Their absence altered the direction of evolution, guiding the living world toward different forms and relationships. The oceans had recovered, but they had also changed. And as these new ecosystems continued evolving, the stage was quietly being set for another remarkable transformation in Earth's biological story. The rise of new dominant forms of marine life that would shape the oceans of the future. Recovery from the ancient ocean crisis did not unfold quickly, but over immense stretches of time the seas slowly regained their vitality. Millions of years passed, and generation after generation of organisms continued adapting to the recovering environment. Gradually, the quiet and simplified oceans of the aftermath began filling with new forms of life. The transformation was subtle at first. Small populations expanded into wider habitats, and the scattered survivors that once struggled to endure began forming more stable communities. Oxygen levels in deeper waters improved as ocean circulation strengthened. Nutrients flowed through marine ecosystems once again, supporting the growth of plankton and other microscopic life that form the foundation of ocean food chains. As these foundations strengthened, the complexity of the oceans slowly returned. Reefs began appearing once more in shallow tropical seas. These new reef systems were not identical to those that had existed before the extinction. Many of the organisms that once built earlier reefs had vanished forever, leaving ecological space for different species to assume the role of reef architects. Over time, new coral, like creatures and other reef-building organisms, formed intricate underwater structures that once again sheltered a wide variety of marine life. Fish, like vertebrates, also began expanding into new ecological roles. Freed from the competition of many ancient predators, these animals diversified into a remarkable range of forms. Some became swift hunters moving through open water, while others specialized in feeding along the seafloor or hiding within reef structures. At the same time, countless invertebrate species spread across the ocean floor. Shell-bearing creatures burrowed into sediments. Filter feeders lined rocky surfaces, capturing drifting particles from passing currents. Crustaceans and other small animals explored every available niche in the recovering ecosystems. These changes did not happen all at once. They unfolded slowly, layer by layer in the fossil record, as each new generation of life expanded into opportunities created by the extinction. Over tens of millions of years, the oceans regained the diversity and complexity that had once nearly vanished. Food chains grew longer and more intricate. Predators and prey developed new strategies for survival. Ecological relationships formed between species that had never existed together before. Eventually, the seas once again became vibrant environments, filled with countless forms of life. This long recovery laid the foundation for many of the evolutionary milestones that would shape the oceans we recognize today. Later, eras would witness the rise of entirely new groups of marine animals, the expansion of complex coral reefs, and the development of ecosystems that closely resemble modern seas. Yet, even as the oceans flourished again, the legacy of the ancient catastrophe remained. Entire branches of life had been erased from the planet. Species that once dominated the seas for millions of years never returned. Their disappearance permanently altered the course of evolution, guiding life along different paths than it might otherwise have taken. In this way, extinction does more than remove species. It reshapes the future. Every mass extinction event leaves a lasting imprint on the history of life. The organisms that survive inherit a transformed world, and their descendants evolve within the opportunities and limitations created by that new environment. The oceans we see today are the result of countless such transformations. To modern observers, the seas may appear timeless. Waves still break against ancient coastlines. Coral reefs shimmer beneath clear tropical waters. Fish glide through currents that seem as old as the planet itself. Yet the truth hidden within the rocks tells a far more dynamic story. The oceans have changed again and again across deep time. They have endured catastrophic disruptions, nearly lost their complex ecosystems, and rebuilt themselves from the fragments that remained. Each recovery has shaped the living world in new and unexpected ways. The oceans of today are not permanent fixtures of Earth's environment. They are the latest chapter in a story written across hundreds of millions of years, a story of collapse, survival, and renewal. And as that long history reaches its final reflection, one question remains quietly waiting beneath the surface. What do these ancient crises reveal about the fragile balance that allows life to flourish on our planet today? From the perspective of a human lifetime, Earth appears steady and dependable. The same continents stretch across familiar maps. Oceans rise and fall against coastlines that seem permanent. Generations grow up believing the world around them has always existed much as it does now, but the deeper history of the planet tells a different story. Across the immense scale of geological time, Earth is never truly still. Beneath the surface, enormous forces move continuously, shaping the environment in ways that unfold so gradually they often escape notice. Continents drift across the planet like slow-moving rafts. Mountains rise and erode away. Oceans open close and change their circulation patterns as the shape of the world evolves. What appears stable over centuries is part of a much longer process of transformation. The ancient toxic oceans explored throughout this journey were not sudden accidents in the history of the planet. They emerged from the interaction of systems that operate quietly over millions of years. Geological forces deep within the Earth released volcanic gases into the atmosphere. Shifts in climate altered ocean temperatures and circulation. Biological processes within the seas themselves reshaped the chemistry of the water. Each influence alone might have seemed insignificant. Together, they created conditions capable of transforming entire ecosystems. One of the most striking lessons hidden within the rock record is how slowly these changes can begin. For long stretches of time, the oceans may appear stable while subtle shifts unfold beneath the surface. Circulation patterns weaken gradually. Oxygen levels decline almost imperceptibly. Microbial activity increases in the quiet depths of the sea. So the creatures living through these early stages, nothing unusual might seem to be happening. Yet the planet continues adjusting. Eventually, those subtle changes accumulate until the balance-sustaining marine life begins to falter. At that point, transformations that once unfolded slowly may accelerate, triggering the dramatic environmental crises preserved in the fossil record. For humans, imagining these processes can be difficult. Our civilizations span only a few thousand years, a brief moment compared to the hundreds of millions of years recorded in Earth's geological archives. Even the longest human histories barely touch the vast timeline that has shaped the oceans. But the rocks beneath our feet, remember. They preserve the chemical signatures of ancient seas that once lost their oxygen. They contain the fossils of organisms that flourished, vanished, and were replaced by entirely new forms of life. Layer by layer, they reveal a world that has never remained exactly the same for long. Understanding this deep history changes the way scientists view the oceans that exist today. Modern marine ecosystems may appear stable, but they are part of the same planetary system that produced the ancient crises described in earlier chapters. The circulation patterns that carry oxygen through the oceans depend on climate, geography, and atmospheric chemistry. The delicate balance sustaining life in the seas arises from countless interacting processes that must remain aligned. The more researchers study Earth's past, the more they appreciate how remarkable that balance truly is. The oceans that sustain life today are not simply permanent features of the planet. They are the product of a long and complex history shaped by geological forces, evolving ecosystems, and environmental cycles that unfold across deep time. And when we step back to view that vast history as a whole, another truth begins to emerge from the evidence. Even through the most dramatic transformations the planet has experienced, life itself has continued finding ways to endure. Throughout the immense history of Earth, life has faced challenges so severe that survival itself once seemed uncertain. The fossil record tells of moments when ecosystems collapsed, when climates shifted rapidly, and when entire branches of the evolutionary tree disappeared forever. Asteroid impacts have darkened the skies. Vast volcanic eruptions have reshaped the atmosphere. Oceans have turned stagnant and toxic, nearly stripping the seas of their complex inhabitants. Yet life has endured every one of these trials. The reason lies in one of the most remarkable qualities of living systems: resilience. Life does not depend on the survival of every species or every ecosystem. Instead, it persists through small pockets of endurance, isolated communities that manage to survive when conditions elsewhere become hostile. During the ancient toxic ocean crises described in this story, countless marine species vanished. Reefs collapsed, food chains unraveled, and the waters that once supported vibrant ecosystems became dangerous environments for many forms of life. But even in those harsh conditions, a few organisms continued to exist. Some endured in shallow coastal regions where waves and winds carried oxygen into the water. Others survived in isolated basins where environmental conditions remained just stable enough to support life. Microorganisms, with their extraordinary adaptability, thrived in environments where more complex creatures could not survive. These scattered survivors became the seeds of recovery. Once environmental conditions began improving, those small populations slowly expanded into the empty ecosystems surrounding them. Over generations, their descendants diversified and adapted, filling ecological roles that had once belonged to species lost during the crisis. This process unfolds gradually across immense spans of time. Millions of years may pass before biodiversity returns to levels comparable to those that existed before an extinction event. Yet eventually, ecosystems grow more complex again. New species emerge. Food webs become richer. The oceans begin to resemble vibrant living systems once more. The seas offer one of the most powerful examples of this resilience. Despite the ancient environmental upheavals that nearly erased complex marine life, the oceans recovered repeatedly. Each recovery created ecosystems that were different from those that had existed before, yet no less intricate or diverse. Entire groups of marine animals that dominate modern seas evolved only after earlier extinctions, cleared the way for new evolutionary possibilities. Every coral reef thriving today stands as a reminder of those long recoveries. Every fish gliding through the currents belongs to a lineage shaped by ancient environmental challenges. Even the smallest plankton, drifting through sunlit waters, carries genetic connections that stretch back through countless cycles of crisis and renewal. Life's persistence is both fragile and extraordinary. It is fragile because the ecosystems supporting it depend on delicate environmental balances. Changes in climate, chemistry, or geography can disrupt those balances and reshape the living world in dramatic ways. Yet it is extraordinary because life rarely disappears completely. Even during the darkest moments in Earth's history, some organisms have found ways to survive. Those survivors carry forward the long continuity of life, ensuring that evolution continues exploring new paths through time. The ancient toxic oceans remind us that life has endured disasters far greater than anything humanity has ever witnessed. And as this story approaches its final reflection, the evidence preserved in ancient rocks offers a deeper understanding of what those distant crises reveal about the planet we call home. The story ends where it began, with the quiet motion of the sea. Across the planet's surface, waves roll endlessly over deep blue water. From the shore, the ocean appears calm and timeless. Tides rise and fall in familiar rhythms, winds ripple across the surface, and sunlight glitters across the horizon in shifting reflections. To those standing on the coastline, the ocean can feel eternal. Yet beneath that peaceful surface lies one of the longest and most dramatic histories on Earth. Far below the waves, the seafloor carries a record written slowly across hundreds of millions of years. Layer by layer, sediments settled into the depths, preserving fragments of ancient worlds. Fossils mark the rise and disappearance of creatures that once filled the oceans. Chemical traces reveal moments when the seas changed in ways invisible to any living observer. Together, these records tell a story that stretches back far beyond human memory. They speak of oceans that once teemed with life so abundant, it reshaped the chemistry of the planet. They reveal eras when coral, like reefs, expanded across shallow seas and food webs, connected thousands of species in delicate ecological balance. But they also tell of darker chapters, times when oxygen vanished from vast regions of water, when microbial chemistry replaced thriving ecosystems, when the seas themselves became hostile environments capable of suffocating the life they once supported. During those ancient crises, entire branches of life disappeared from the planet. The oceans came dangerously close to losing much of the complexity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve. And yet life endured. Scattered survivors carried the continuity of life forward through those difficult ages. Generation after generation, they rebuilt ecosystems from fragments left behind by extinction. Over immense spans of time, the seas filled once again with diverse forms of life. The oceans recovered, but they never returned exactly to the worlds that existed before. Each crisis reshaped the course of evolution, guiding life toward new possibility. The creatures that dominate modern oceans are not simply descendants of ancient ecosystems. They are the outcome of countless recoveries, each one following environmental transformations that altered the direction of life itself. In this way, the oceans hold a memory of the planet's past. Every reef rising from tropical waters, every fish moving through shifting currents, and every drifting plankton cell carries traces of a lineage that survived challenges older than human civilization. The living seas are shaped by events that unfolded across geological timescales, far beyond the reach of human experience. The ancient toxic oceans remind us of something profound about the nature of Earth. The environments that sustain life are never completely fixed. They change as the planet itself changes. Climate, geology, chemistry, and biology interact continuously, shaping conditions that allow ecosystems to flourish, or forcing them to adapt. Yet within that constant transformation lies an extraordinary pattern. Life continues. Again and again across billions of years, life has endured crises that seemed capable of ending it. From the quiet depths of early oceans to the vibrant marine ecosystems of today, living organisms have found ways to adapt, evolve, and rebuild the world around them. The waves that move across the surface of the sea today are part of that long story. They pass over reefs that grew from ancient recoveries. They travel across waters where ecosystems were rebuilt after unimaginable loss. They reflect a sky above a planet whose living systems have endured more change than any single species could ever witness. The oceans appear timeless, but their history is a story of survival written across deep time. And as the waves continue their endless motion across the surface of the modern sea, they carry forward a legacy shaped by countless cycles of destruction, renewal, and life's quiet persistence.